How's your eyesight?
Not yet.
We'll keep praying. Action. Well, good morning. Try that again. Good morning. Good morning. Everyone have a good week last week? Good Saturday. Hopefully your Saturday was a little less eventful as what mine and Josh and Dad's. It wasn't bad. It's just I'm feeling it this morning. What's that? Yeah, you are too. You just won't admit it. I'm glad you're all here this morning. Good opportunity to get started. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your attention. We'll get rolling. As custom, we'll look back at last week, lesson 5. Do a quick review. Talked about God's wisdom and ours. And really knowing the will of the Father, understanding what His will is, what He desires. Tried to make the connection with the military and the commander's intent and understanding what the overall end game of the goal is, knowing what God wants, what His will is. James 3, good example of wisdom from above. And these are just a couple examples: gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits. Just some examples of wisdom from above that we can use to apply into our lives and our relationships as we, whatever our daily activities, wherever we find ourselves. And then tried to tie that together with 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul said, For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. So taking the wisdom that we learn, the commander's intent, which God's will, the wisdom that we learn, that we practice, and using that in our daily lives to ultimately win souls to Christ. Any questions or comments on that? So following along with that, obviously the topic on the screen is not something that we can, there are really 2 topics on the screen, neither of those in which I think we could cover in a 45-minute period. I don't know that we could fully cover one in a day. But to do a little bit of investigative work to try to understand what that really means and to understand the differences that we see in God's nature and in God's character. So God's wrath and God's love. I think this is really illustrated, it's illustrated well in multiple places throughout the Bible. But in a place that we may not typically think of it is John 3:16. says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And so essentially what we see there in John 3:16 is God did this, gave a Son. If we do this, believe in him, then we don't receive the punishment, and instead we have everlasting life. And so the word perish and the word salvation, I thought it was interesting. The definition of perish in the Greek is to fully destroy. To fully destroy. Very interesting words that are used there. And then obviously salvation, there were a couple different ways to think about that, but essentially it meant to live presently and in the future. To live presently and in the future. So understanding that the good news is really good news in context of the bad news. And to understand those differences and that dichotomy. And I think this is an interesting way of thinking about it, at least it's the way I think about it. Maybe you may think about it a little better, a little differently. But I think about the word dichotomy, and it's in kind of this, you have these two ideas, the wrath of God and the love of God, that almost seem to be competing ideas or contradictory ideas, which is not the case. But I love the idea of thinking about it in context to show kind of the breadth and the depth of God. Not that we could ever really fully understand the breadth and the depth of who he is, but just understanding the full scope of who our God is. So when you look at John 3:16, and sometimes, again, it's just the way that I process things. Sometimes I read things in reverse. And so we can choose life or death based on how we respond to Jesus, which is our only option from God. Just another way that I kind of thought about it. We can choose life, salvation, or we can choose perish based on how we respond to the gift of Jesus, which is our option from the Father. So how do we do that? So in context of God's wrath, God is faithful, so he provided an opportunity or an escape from that destruction, just like he talks about in 1 Corinthians, where he provides an opportunity or an escape from temptation. So God, being faithful, provides an opportunity, an escape from that destruction. So jumping into it this morning, any questions so far? Any comments? And the idea of, we talked about last week, what is wisdom? The beginning of wisdom is what? Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? So having that understanding, and it's not necessarily intended to be where we should be afraid to approach him, because we'll see that's not his nature, but to understand who he is and who we are not is maybe a better way of understanding that, right? So having that healthy fear and understanding that there are differences in God, right? And I think we're going to see, at least the intent when we get to 10:15, is that the foundation of our Father in heaven is good, is love. But there's a different thing, there's a different component that we need to look at. So the wrath of God. So in context of this, we'll need a couple or three readers. So God's wrath is always judicial. Examining the idea of God's wrath is always judicial. Can I get someone to read Psalm 62:12, please?
Also to you
Also to you, O Lord, belongs mercy, for you render, interesting word there, render to each one according to his work. What does the word render mean? Is that? To put together, to complete. When you read the definition, there's a completeness about it. It kind of ties it together. Can also mean reward in context this way. It's a reward. Proverbs 24:12. Can I get someone to read Proverbs 24:12?
If you say, surely you did not know this, does not he who weighs the heart consider it? He who keeps your soul, does he not know it? And will he not render to each man according to his deeds?
Again, we see this idea, and will he not render to each man according to his deeds? Again, same word, render. To complete, to put together, a reward. And then last, Romans 2:5-6.
But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds.
Again, the idea of, so verbiage changes a little bit here. What does it say? How does it describe it? What word does he use? It's a particular word I'm looking for there. What's that? It does use render again. The word that I'm looking at is treasuring. The idea of treasuring. So now keep that in context. We're talking about the wrath of God and treasure. Just think about that dichotomy, right? Because you think about treasuring up. If you treasure something up, I mean, how do we treasure up today, right? I mean, some very simple ways to look at that would be maybe our savings account or bank account. I mean, there are different ways that you can do that, right? But the idea of treasuring up, what does that suggest? What's that? Well, it suggests that well, yes, in that context. But in this context, when you're treasuring up, it's, what's that? There's something of value. But we're storing up. We're storing up based on our deeds. So again, what is God looking at? So the wrath of God, what is he really looking at here? Our deeds. Our deeds. The choices that we make. The choices that we make. And we're going to come back to that word judicial in just a minute, or here towards the end. So the wrath of God, God's wrath is designed to give men what they choose. Can I have someone read John 3:18-21, please? So several times there in John 3, we see the word deeds. What does that really mean? And again, I'm driving towards a direction here. When we talk about deeds, what are we talking about? It's your actions. It's your actions. So I thought it was interesting that when, again, looking at the Greek and the definition and the context and the way this word is used, it's work or employment. So you think about employment. When you're employed, right? When you're employed to do something, what are you doing? And it doesn't matter who the employer is, or whatever your job is. Now let's look at it from an occupational standpoint. When you're employed to do something, there's typically a task or a series of tasks, and a lot of times, at least in my line of work, they're repetitive. I do almost the same thing I do it 12 times a month. I do these series of tasks every month, and then just repeat that. So you think about when we're employed in an occupation, there's a goal, right? There's something that we're working towards. And so again, the idea of understanding God's wrath, our behavior, what are we working towards? What are we driving towards? Matthew 16:25. Matthew 16:24 through 26. So whoever desires to lose his life, whoever desires to save his life, the word desire. So 3 questions on the screen. In context of God's wrath, what do we desire? What are we working towards? And what are we earning? And do we think about it like that? Does the world think about it like that? To your point earlier, Tay, you made the comment, or at least it seemed like the intent of your comment was that people think of God as a cruel God, some, right? And then maybe there's the other end of that spectrum where people just only view the loving side of God. So what about the people that only view God from the cruel side or from the wrathful side? Are there examples of things in the Bible that we kind of look at and go, that doesn't feel good? Yeah, it's all in there. But in context of God's wrath, is he a wrathful God that's uncontrollable anger, just rage, just waiting for us to make a mistake, to pounce? Or is it in response to what we desire, what we're working towards, our intent? I'm not talking about a singular, hey, you made a mistake. Well, we've all fallen short, right? We've all sinned and fallen short. That's not the intent here. Yes, sir? Yeah, it happens all the time. It happens all the time.
We have to be careful about
Yeah. No, it's not, and I think we'll see that too. But I think ultimately I think maybe for the world, sometimes for us too. I think these are all good lessons for us to remember. But maybe for someone who's a little younger in their faith, or for the world that doesn't have this proper understanding of God and who He is, there's this, it's insinuated, or there's this idea that He's just an out of control, angry God, and just looking for opportunities for us to make a mistake. And that's just not who He is. Yes, sir.
Abraham is held up in the Bible as being a prime example of faith. He used his life on several occasions to preserve his own life. Why wasn't God's wrath applied there?
He was looking at the cross the whole time.
Yeah. I can't speak for God.
Well, he eventually did. He punished Abraham for that. And remember, he fixed Sarah's womb so she could not have a son, which he had promised Abraham. And he dealt with that until he was 95 years old before God opened her womb and miraculously allowed her to have a son of promise, which he had made to Abraham. So somehow in there, he forgave Abraham for his times when he lost his faith, and eventually blessed him with the promise that he had made him when he left where Haran, where he told him to live.
Yeah. It's a good point and a good perspective.
When it comes to what we're working for, I like how you pulled out Romans 2:6, because there's other scriptures that point to that God will render to each one according to his deeds. Like the day of judgment, as Jesus said, we'll either serve one or two masters. So we're either laying up treasures in heaven, or we're serving the devil, or we're serving sin, and we will receive our wages. It just depends which direction we go in our entire life. So what are we working towards?
Well, not that we can control God, but we have more of a say-so in the matter than the things that we choose, right?
Yeah, he gives free will.
Yeah. Yeah.
We work for who we want to work for.
That's right. That's right. So again, if that's the way God operates, then it's not God sitting back and waiting. Yeah, absolutely. Any questions on that? So let's look at a couple verses about the love of God. God's love, when we think about the love of God, it is an exercise of His goodness. It is an exercise of who He is and His goodness. Psalms 145:9, if I could get two readers, Psalms 145:9 and Luke 6:35.
The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works.
Can I get someone to read Luke 6:35, please?
So love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great. You will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the unthankful and evil.
So He is kind to the unthankful and evil. So Luke 6:35 says He is kind to the unthankful and the evil. So in context of that, there's something that I want to go back and point out. When we read Proverbs 24, verse 11 earlier, there's a statement in there. It says, it's verse 11. It says, "Deliver those who are drawn towards death, and hold back those stumbling to the slaughter. Hold back those stumbling to the slaughter. Think on that imagery for a minute. Just imagine someone kind of stumbling towards their own death. So what does that require? I mean, they're kind of focused in a direction, right? And they're just barely getting there. They're very weak, likely, exhausted, but they're still moving in the direction of what? The slaughter. Stumbling towards the slaughter, right? Talks about holding back those who are stumbling towards the slaughter. So let me ask you this, and before I jump into Luke 6, when we see sin that's fully developed and someone kind of, let's just for the sake of the conversation say they kind of got what they earned. Is our position, or is it okay for our position to be like, oh well, they got what they earned? Or, kind of take a position of, well, hate it, but you kind of get what you get. Is that an okay position or an okay attitude for us to take? I don't think so. I think when we see those, it's sad, right? It should be sad. It should be heartbreaking. Should never want to see someone going through that, even though maybe that's what they worked towards. Because sometimes, again, and looking at Proverbs 24, hold back those stumbling towards the slaughter. That just to me sounds like someone who really doesn't know what they're doing. They really don't understand where they're going.
But if we think that way, we're not thinking like God.
No.
Acts 17:30, God desires no man to be lost. He desires all to come to repentance. So if we are happy about somebody being lost, okay, we've got the wrong mindset.
Yeah, we've totally missed the boat on that. And so when you think about it in that context of Luke 6:35, it says, God is kind to the unthankful and evil. He says, love your enemies. So what is that really saying? God is kind and thankful to his enemies. Love your enemies. Be like God. So if that's really the intent, to be like God, to be kind to the enemies, then we wouldn't necessarily have that attitude of when someone finds themselves in a situation where sin grew into something in their life that's painful and nasty, which is what happens, then we would not find that to be a pleasant scenario. We would take a position of compassion and empathy. And the way I hear that is be like God. Which if that's the intent, right, then it's not wrathful. And now there obviously we understand there is a component of the judicial side of God to allow men to get what they choose, but that is not ultimately who God wants to be. If that was who God wanted to be, then I don't even think there would have been an option for Jesus. Because that was really our opportunity for salvation. Yes, sir. Mm.
Do what's right. And he just decided God is love. He talks about
Do we take it that way though? When, yeah. No, I don't always, when you find, what's that?
Stuck in that moment,
Yeah.
whatever that moment is. This is unfair. How could this happen? I want this. We're all little children in this sense. And here, God is the parent. This means something down the road. This is for your better. This is for your future. This is for your character. This is going to have compound consequences down the road. But we're stuck in that moment, just like the world's stuck in that moment. We're all human. And to change your mind from thinking about that moment to the end result is the process of gaining wisdom.
Well said. Can I get a couple readers, please? 3. Romans 8, 32, Romans 5, 8, and then 1 John 4, 7 through 11.
He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?
So who was delivered? Who was given in that verse? Jesus. And who was he given for? For all. So Jesus was given for all. Okay. So Romans 5, 8.
But God demonstrates his own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
Okay. So Christ's death for sinners was a demonstration of what? Of God's love. Of God's love, right? It wasn't a demonstration of this wrathful God, this angry God, out of control God. It was a demonstration of his love. So I'm trying to draw the division between the two here. 1 John 4, 7, 11.
Love, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. And the love of God was manifested towards us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son through the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
I think verse 11 is so interesting, right? Because you look at this, you look at what John's saying is God is love. God sent his Son to demonstrate the love so that we could live. And if God did this, then what? Then we should also love others. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. So again, looking at kind of the foundation of who God is. So understanding that God's wrath is always judicial. It's always a response to either our evil hearts or deeds, or I don't even want to say correction, because that's not wrath. I think that's love. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. But you're absolutely right that sometimes we may get those things confused, right? Maybe we are maybe God is satisfied, right, to an extent. I don't want to put words in God's mouth, obviously, but there's something that God needs to correct us on, and that feels painful in the moment, and it doesn't feel good in the moment. And so maybe we take that as his wrath, but in reality, it's love. It's love. So does love always feel lovely? That's a hard one. What's that?
Again, because we're stuck in that moment. We don't look at it that way, though. It's the way we view
it. Yeah. Had something I want to read you guys. So I read quite a bit. Something that I came across, and again, this is not necessarily, it's a psychologist that wrote this book, but he makes a statement in this book, and he's talking about love. I thought this was very interesting. He said, love is not simply giving, it is judicious giving and judicious withholding as well. It is judicious praising and judicious criticizing. It is judicious arguing, struggling, confronting, urging, pushing, and pulling, in addition to comforting. It's leadership. The word judicious means requiring judgment, and judgment requires more than instinct. It requires thoughtful and often painful decision making. Now, as I read that, I can't help but think about how often is God urging, pushing, pulling, struggling with us? Not that he has to, but why does he do it? Because he loves us. Yeah. Couple readers tie this together, Proverbs 3:12 and then Hebrews 12.
The Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights.
So correction may not always feel pleasant in the moment. But if God loves us, then what's he willing to do? What's he going to do? He's going to correct us. Is that God's wrath? That is not God's wrath. And that does not mean that God is sitting around waiting for us to make a mistake so that he can give us what we deserve. Although he can do that, but that's not the intent of who God is. And in these moments, what's the intent? When God administers correction, the goal is it's for us to grow, it's for us to mature, and it's ultimately for us to be more like him. But it doesn't always feel that way. So love doesn't always feel lovely. Hebrews 12:4-11, please.
Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Remember those who rule over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith followed, considering the outcome of their conduct. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do not be carried about with various and strange doctrines, for it is good that the heart be established by grace, not with foods which have not yet profited those who have been occupied with them. We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. That helps them in the right chapter, doesn't it?
I was sitting there and going, oh man, I wrote the wrong thing down. I'm sorry.
You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving again. Right?
Yes.
And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless afterwards it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it.
I think the end of verse 10 and verse 11, it's so powerful. But he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So, understanding the differences, that there is a wrathful side of God in response to our actions, our behavior, our thoughts, our intent. If it's evil, then we're going to face that. If we're moving and driving that in that direction, we will earn that. Very clearly, he states that we render, right? He will render. He will render means to reward, to complete. We're treasuring up those moments. But it's not who God is. God is love. God provided his Son as an opportunity for us to escape the destruction, provided that way of escape through Jesus. And ultimately, it says God is what? Good to, it said, unthankful and evil men, right? And if that's who God is, and it talks about here very plainly, it very plainly says, and now you look at the love component, that he corrects those whom he loves, then in those moments of correction, it's not wrath, it's actually love. And so love doesn't always feel lovely. And so understanding for us to understand, and then also helping the world to understand that correction is not the wrath of God, it's actually the love of God. And knowing that he is a good God. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Josh, if there was ever anybody who deserved the wrath of God, it was Saul. When he was persecuting Christians and doing all the things that he was doing. But God knew Saul's heart. And so he gave him an opportunity to repent and follow him. And once Paul did that, he still faced all kinds of trials and persecutions and hardships, but God was with him, God took care of him, because he wanted Paul to do the things that he had set out for him to do, and Paul did.
That's such an encouraging lesson to us all, right? Because we all have that opportunity, because we've all, to a degree, been where Paul was. And we have that opportunity to be used as a vessel through God's forgiveness and his love.